have the pleasure and the honor of Charles Moyer talking to you. If you know anything about the Inter-American human rights system, it has at least three important legs. And Charles was a key person in each of the three legs. One is the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, with headquarters in Washington, D.C., with quasi-judicial, promotional, political, diplomatic functions. And Charles was a staff lawyer and then executive secretary between 1970 and 1979. Some of the crucial years of the Inter-American Commission, where, if you know anything about the history of Latin America, in the 70s, we have the Club de las Espadas in South America, or the Club of Sport with military dictatorship all over South America, civil wars in Central America, and the Commission had to deal with massive human rights abuses in that time, and probably helped to shape how the Commission in part reacted to that new context. Then he moved to Costa Rica, to the second leg, crucial leg of the Inter-American system, the Inter-American Court of Human Rights. He became the first registrar of the court, something quite unusual for an American lawyer to be the registrar of an Inter-American and international court when the US cannot accept the jurisdiction of the court. But it's a testimony of how people value and respect the work of Charles Moyer. And he played a crucial role in shaping the early years of the Inter-American Court. When the court got established, ruled on the first couple of advisory opinions, and I would say the most important human rights case of any international human rights court, that is the Velázquez-Rodriguez case. That is still 40 years ago. Almost 40 years. We still have to study that. And I always say, if you don't want to read too much, but you want to know human rights, just read Velázquez-Rodriguez and you are done, you become an expert. And the rest is just pure interpretation of an application of Velázquez-Rodriguez. And the third leg of the Inter-American system is the Inter-American Institute of Human Rights. That is a promotional leg of the system, headquartered in Costa Rica, and just spent, I don't know, 20 years there or something like that. Yeah, working on developing new projects and training generations of human rights advocates in particularly Latin America. So thank you so much, Charlie, and it's an honor to have you here. Thank you.
Well, thank you. I'm afraid that after that, this whole thing's going to be a downer. I'm sorry. Also, I'm late. I misunderstood when it was supposed to start. Anyhow, I'd like to thank Karen. Karen?
She disappeared.
For the invitation. This isn't the first time. I don't know whether you noticed on the post for the announcement, there was a picture of me, and it appears that I have the same tie on. The truth is, it was a 50-50 chance, because it was either this tie or the other tie that I had. When I started at the commission in May of 1970, the commission was composed of what I seemed to feel at the time, a bunch of old people. There are 7 members of the commission. They're elected in their own capacity. That means that being 7, which I think at the time was 1/3 of the number of members of the OAS. They, unlike in the European Commission, at the time where each state was represented, the idea was that they were they were elected in their own capacity. Meant they were independent of their local state. And at the time, the the commission early on had done some things, but they were in a kind of slumberous state when I got there. They were they were all, I thought, really old. And they just sort of sat around, not much going on. Some years ago, I Googled them, and I found out that the truth was, at that time, they were some 15, 20 years younger than I am right now. So it's a question of perception, I guess. But they did do three things that were really important for the future of the system. And they did them as sort of without the governments knowing what they did. One is when the commission was established, it was a kind of afterthought of a meeting that was held in Santiago, Chile. The purpose of the meeting, as I recall, was to suspend the government of Cuba from the OAS because of Fidel Castro. And I don't know whose initiative it was, but it was decided pretty much on the spur of the moment, to create a commission. And the idea was that they would go, the commission would be in charge of promoting the United. But soon after the commission was established in 1959, they started to receive a great number of claims, mostly from Cuban exiles in Miami. And they felt that they couldn't do their job without somehow processing these complaints. And so they had been told, or ordered in effect, when the commission was established in its statute, that they were only to do promotional things and not to accept complaints. They did it anyhow, and nobody, and the government's been saying. The second initiative that they took was also in the statute that the OAS had adopted for the commission, was they could visit different countries as long as they had that country's permission. But once again, it was just for one reason, and not to examine the situation in particular country. They did it anyhow, under the government's complaint. The third thing was when when they were examining the complaints that they were receiving, they would send them to the government and asking for the government's explanation. Governments adopted the tactic of simply not responding. So what the commission decided was, what is the rules? That if the government didn't answer within a certain period of time, at that time I think it was 180 days, now it's much shorter, that they would assume that what was complained about was true. Once again, the government's in. All of those three things have been pretty much the cornerstones of the commission's work. They now accept complaints. They visit countries. The commission has made over 100 on-site visits to countries to examine either specific matters or the general situation. As I said, I started in 1970, and I really don't know what the commission did from 1970 to September 1973, even though I worked there. I hardly did it. I translated some documents. The commission at that time had an executive secretary and 3 lawyers. I was kind of the token American. And, because for some reason, they felt that there should be somebody from the United States. But my Spanish wasn't all that good. And it was a kind of an old boys group, and then there was me. So I didn't know how to do it. Until the incident or the person who changed the whole dynamic of the commission was Augusto Pinochet. When the coup happened in Chile, it changed the whole panorama. Human rights had been violated throughout before that, but nothing had the impact of the coup in Chile. One thing was pretty drastic, and I think the other thing was the president, Allende, was a socialist. And a lot of the European countries thought, got interested in it because here was a socialist president, probably one of the very few that ever existed in all the hemisphere. Had been not only thrown out of power, but he was also killed. And so worldwide, there was a huge, very strong reaction to the coups. And so the commission decided, the commission had been somewhat reinvigorated by the arrival of a new member who was a pretty strong force. And the commission decided to ask to go to Chile. And the government said no. Government invited then the UN Commission, and the UN Commission accepted. So Pinochet said, well, the UN's coming. So you don't need two commissions going there. But when the UN Commission got to Peru and started interviewing exiles from Chile, Pinochet said, no, you can't come. So he revoked the permission. And the commission said, well, now it's our turn. So the commission went and wrote a report. And the report had a huge impact in Chile, although it wasn't distributed in Chile. It was prohibited. I've heard stories about how people, I think I'd heard, and I don't know if it's true, there were 3 copies in all of Chile of the commission's report. These were the days, I guess you could go like this and turn out. And people would wrap them as Christmas presents, or birthday presents, and say, your wife's birthday, do that kind of thing. But Pinochet made a huge mistake in that, as it turned out, one mistake. He invited the OAS General Assembly to meet in Chile. It was the first time the General Assembly had ever met outside of the United States. And the assembly lasted 5 days. And 3 or 4 of those days were devoted to the debate on the Chilean report. You have to realize at this time, among the members of the OAS, only Costa Rica, Venezuela, maybe Colombia, maybe Mexico, all the other countries led either by a military person or somebody who were put in power by them. So the ambience wasn't very good for a resolution condemning Chile. And so the debate went. until it came time for the representative of the United States, who was not the ambassador, but this the second person, made an extremely powerful speech in favor of the commission and against the regime of government of Chile. That turned, it was amazing how I happened to have been there. And I was sitting on the podium behind the chairman of the commission. And I touched him on his throat. I said, I can feel the change here. It was something that it's hard to explain, but the tension that had been, you could feel the whole thing changing. Because the other countries also, the democracies, were the Caribbean countries. And they hadn't been called on yet to speak either. And so there had been a resolution that passed around that condemned the commission and praised the government of Chile for upholding Christian standards, etc. There were 3 members of the commission in Chile, but they decided they were going to resign if this passed. It didn't pass because of the intervention of this American representative. In truth, when the General Assembly ended, the chairman, I was going to go back to Washington, the chairman was from Venezuela. He said, tell the representative that we're really grateful for what he did, because it really did save the commission. So I went back and I said to the representative, I said, the chairman really thanks you. And he started to laugh. I said, well, why are you laughing? He said, well, you're going to talk to my assistant. It turned out that Henry Kissinger was there the first day as Secretary of State. He had told Pinochet that, look, I'm going to have to say some things, you're not going to like them, but that's it. You have our support. When he heard that the representative had gone against his order with that, he called the ambassador to the OEA, who was his representative boss, and said, fire that guy. The ambassador said, look, I know that you're my boss, but I'll tell you this, I'm going to have to give a press conference. Say, well, I hired. And we never had this conversation. And in truth, when Jimmy Carter became president, he named Robert Moyer, who was Human Rights and Registrar, as ambassador to one of the 2 countries, El Salvador, Paraguay, I don't remember in which order, as ambassador. So this whole thing revived the commission after these years of doing very little. And almost immediately after that, it opened the door to visits to other countries and reports on a lot of countries. We're talking about I left in 79. I remember on successive days, and at the time I was in part of things in the secretariat, that we received on successive days 3 invitations for visit. Now, an invitation for visit is not an easy thing. The preparations are long. The visits are. One of them was Nicaragua, for example, and it was during the Civil War, which was a little bit. And it also means the reports had to be written. So the stress in the secretariat was considerable, especially because at one time I was the only lawyer. I was juggling a lot of balls. So I think that the reports on Uruguay, before I left it at the end of 1970, there were reports on Argentina, reports on Uruguay, El Salvador, Haiti, Panama, Nicaragua. So these reports of the commission have a huge, that is the power of the commission. The commission can only make recommendations, and they can publicize the situations through reports on country. The reports and the visits especially have a number of roles they play, in the sense that when the commission goes to a place, the groups that are working internally feel supported by the fact that somebody is coming to the home. And also, when part of the visit is offices are open in different places in the country to receive complaints. For example, when the commission went to Argentina, in spite of the fact that the military, which had been responsible for up to 35,000 deaths through disappearances, people lined up to present their complaints. And I remember, this was a little bit before I left, the commission, I think the commission brought back 35 boxes, 40 boxes, just filled with complaints of people who were willing to expose themselves, in effect, to possible problems by filing a complaint. The commission also has also issues reports on themes, not only on countries, but also things like recent ones were on the pandemic and human rights, and on women deprived of liberty in the Americas, and those things. And one of the other roles of the commission is to present cases to the court. Now, the court was established in 1979, were the first meetings. And the commission didn't send any cases to the court until 1985. And the reasons for that are, I'm not sure. I don't know how much of it was jealousy. The commission was king of the heap for a long time, and all once the court comes, and because they think they're judges, they think, well, we're the new kings of the heap. And I think the commission didn't like that very much. And the commission was extremely proud of what it had done, built up a super reputation. Nobody except the governments spoke ill of the commission. And they were afraid that the court, which members of the judges of the court had made some missteps early. They said some things that they probably shouldn't have said, in the sense of a kind of we're the new guys, we're the new sheriff in town. And, so the members of the commission, I think, felt that all the work they had done was sort of not put in danger, but it was might be tarnished by these unproven judges. The judges had no track record. So as Ariel explained, the first case that came to the court was probably the very worst case that could have been presented. Although as it turned out, it was the very best case. I always expected that if the commission had any sense, what they would have sent is a trial case, some case easy to decide, some case that probably against the country that probably or would easily accept the response. So on a violation that probably wasn't a very serious violation, just so that the court could sort of kick off the training wheels, sort of practice. Well, that's not what happened. I think, although I don't know exactly how it happened, but I suspect what happened was that the chairman of the commission finally said, send those people a case. And what they did was, I can say this because I didn't work there anymore, but they just took a file of a case and said, the papers weren't in order. It was just a whole bunch of papers. It was probably about this thick. And the court, we had to spend, I don't know how many days putting them chronologically, throwing out the ones that didn't count, and so. They didn't follow any of the procedures that they were supposed to follow. And they were against the Supreme Court, which are the very toughest cases to resolve, because there's no evidence, because it's just nothing. And not only is there no evidence, there were no treaties against forced disappearances. And so the commission, the court, excuse me, went stage by stage of these were against the government of Honduras. And the government of Honduras presented a number of preliminary objections because the commission didn't follow anything. You're supposed to have a declaration of admissible. You're supposed to have a hearing. Well, there's procedure for hearing. 0. You're supposed to have a friendly settlement. You have to get the parties together and see if you can resolve this before you go any further. 0. You're supposed to, the claimant's supposed to exhaust internal revenues. The government said they didn't do it. It was just a mess, an absolute mess. Well, the commission, or the court, excuse me, the court, using a practice, an international practice, it sort of says that international jurisdiction, you don't have to follow the formal rules. I'm not so sure that, but the court found it really didn't matter when we disability because it didn't change it. You didn't have to have a hearing. You didn't have to. Oh, they also said about a visit. You had to have a visit, and this is what the rules say. But the court said we can't have a commission. We can't have an on-site visit for every single incident. Just not practical. So, finally, there was one that they didn't follow the rules about sending the case to the court. The whole procedure, you send it, make a report, you send it to the country, and then it's a little bit. The convention not very clear. Within 3 months, one of them can send it to them. Nonetheless, the court very cleverly got around all of the preliminary objections of the government I really believe that, if the government had paid a good bit of money to a really good law firm, they would have won the case. Because I know that one of the judges was Thomas Bergenthal, who was a professor of law here, who was one of the two real drivers. He was the only, I don't know whether this is true. In the court, I know it's true. He's the only person that came to the court early on who had any background. All the other people, they were interested in human rights, but they weren't professors of human rights, they hadn't studied human rights. One was a politician, who eventually became president of this country. Another one at a university. They were people who've been around. They didn't know anything about your system. But Bergenthal, he certainly did. He probably knew it better than almost anybody. And so I know that he one of some really good lawyers had been there arguing. Bergenthal wouldn't have embarrassed himself by not accepting, but was pretty obvious. The defense of Honduras so bad that, for instance, they started off. And it might be very much. This is an international court, and all they could think of was their local customs or something. So the first guy gets up and he says, "In the name of Jesus Christ, please give us strength," or whatever it is. And there's Bergenthal, a Jewish fellow sitting up there. I mean, at one time, well, I have to tell you about the hearings. But at one time in the hearings, that guy, the only way that the court could prove, proof may not be right, is to find the violation, is to gather evidence of like things. So they had a number of witnesses who had disappeared and then joined society. They had other witnesses who tried to use the internal remedies. They had other witnesses who had seen people being disappeared, so they knew the modus operandi. And so that's how the case was built. And one fellow who had disappeared was a witness, and the lawyer for the government said, "Isn't it true that you belong to this left-wing society when you were a student?" He said, "Yes." He said, "I'm surprised you didn't know, because we used to meet in your house because your son was born." I mean, it wasn't. But this case, being the first, had the advantage and the disadvantage of presenting all kinds of problems. The court, for example, can order provisional measures, which they order governments to protect people, that witnesses, victims who are being threatened. They use provisional measures for a number of people. And what happened? In one case, well, they finally found a witness that was supposedly involved in the last time they saw the victim in the disappearance. He had some physical defect, so he was easily identified. He was a sergeant. They subpoenaed him to be a witness on a certain date, and 2 days before, or 3 days before, he was on a regular bus, got off the bus, and was murdered. And tried to make it like it was some radical left wing, they put a flag or something on top. 2 days later, one of the witnesses who had been president of a local human rights group in San Pedro Sula, he was standing talking to a guy in the street, and both of them were murdered. This was like serious business, and it said here the court had ordered the governments to protect these people. It, another thing, this is another thing that Bergenthal did. The use of amicus curiae briefs is not very common, I think not common at all in Latin America. And he introduced it into the court. And it was a huge help because the briefs were a big help in to help the thinking of that. I was going to also, I'm going to speak a few minutes about. I chose impact and the future because I'm really proud of, still proud of what the commission and the court have done and still do. But there are dark clouds. One is funding. Funding is always a problem, I think, everywhere, but especially in the American system. The problem with the whole system is sort of built precariously. What you have are governments who have agreed to create bodies to, in effect, attack. Well, that works for a while, but it doesn't always work all the time. And in fact, certain countries have gotten out of the system. Trinidad got out because they felt they were unfairly attacked by the commission. Other countries get out because their situation, Venezuela, has gotten out. They don't want to be bothered with the commission or the court. Peru threatens to leave every once in a while. And I think that the system, because of its nature, it's a, to use a cliche, it's like a house of cards in the sense that I think if two or three big countries, say Brazil, Argentina, Chile, Mexico, if they would pull out, and it wouldn't take much, I don't think, to make the whole thing. I think funding, and you think that now the OAS contributes to the court 65%. The government now is talking about getting rid of funding for NATO and the UN. Or, I don't know, at least reduce it. You see that in newspapers. I don't know why they haven't. I think perhaps the OAS doesn't seem to matter to them, but the OAS would be a much easier target for them. And I think the OAS, I think the United States puts in more than half. If they pull out their funds, I think that there are also other problems that, besides funding. I think that it's my impression that the court, there's, oddly enough, the people who are elected to these offices are really smart people, but sometimes they're not street smart. And they do things that for reasons that Sometimes it's arrogance. Sometimes it's an attempt to go further than they should. I mean, the government take it so far. For instance, I'm translating a case now where the case is about whether you can keep a president in power in term, in a sense, indefinite, just re-elections. You can't expect, this is a case of Nicaragua, you can't expect that you're gonna deliver a judgment and it's not gonna be obeyed. There has to be some sense of responsibility in a sense that you have to realize what kind of situation you're in. It's like a little guy, no, but you have to know where you stand.
Charles, we want to leave a little time for questions.
Oh, okay, I'm gonna finish. Thanks. I don't want to finish without paying tribute to the person who mightily influenced human rights in the hemisphere. When I joined the secretariat in 1970, the convention had been written 6 months earlier. Only one country had ratified. In 1973, Colombia ratified. It wasn't even a big deal. I found out about it reading the newspaper. I went and told my boss, the executive secretary, he didn't even know about it. On June 1st, 1977, a few months after he had been elected president, Jimmy Carter went to the OAS, signed the convention, and began a campaign to ratify countries to ratify. He sent Andrew Young to Haiti. He sent his wife Rosalind to Central America. He made it a condition of the canal for Panama to ratify. In 13 months, they got the 11 ratifications that were necessary through the efforts of Jimmy Carter. So that enabled the commission to be working under a treaty-based instrument, and it enabled the existence of the court. Impressive. That's it. It should be for Jimmy Carter.
We have some time for questions. You didn't
Yeah.
even start.
Hey, thank you for being here. I wanted to ask you about the commission back in the '70s after your report in Chile. It seems like there was a lot of, I mean, y'all were doing work in countries all across the globe with dictators or all across America, the Americas with dictators. Why was the Argentinian regime okay with the commission doing work in Argentina? For example,
Ariel can answer that first. I think I don't think there's any explanation. I don't know what they gained. The reputation was so bad that allowing the commission there wasn't gonna. I don't know what the pressures were. Ariel, do you know?
Yeah, so there was another pope who died when Argentina was negotiating with the commission, and Vice President was Moyer, Vice President of Carter. He went to the funeral of the Pope with the president or the dictator of Argentina. They met at the funeral, and the Vice President said, "We want you to let the Inter-American Commission to come." And the president said, "We want to buy a couple of ships because there was an arms embargo against Argentina." And so the US said, "Yes, we will let you buy these commercial ships, but you let the commission go." That was a behind the scene negotiation.
But yeah, there was
Yeah.
one thing I didn't mention. At one time, Senator Kennedy put in as part of a law that any country that didn't accept an invitation of the commission, there would be no more arms sales to that country. And I guess that was part of it.
Okay.
Nobody else?
Don't be afraid.
I ran over the time you're finished, you went out.
So just to put in perspective what Charlie was saying about the budget, the last budget of the Inter-American Court received like $5-6 million from the OES. And the budget of our UT athletic department last year was $300 million. So imagine the priority where the priorities are. And there's just one athletic department
And
versus the only regional human rights system.
but,
in the
you know,
Americas.
that's a lot of money. I think it's 8 million. When I worked there, it was,
That's it. Yeah.
I remember,
$250,000.
one of the worst days I had was that, I had to go before 3 guys, they were going over the budget. And I had to present the budget of the commission. And so I went there and I gave this speech about how important human rights are, blah, 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 blah. And they said, well, that's not very convincing. We come back, and I don't know how many. Fortunately, and the reason I bring this up, Bergenthal, as I said, was a professor here, and he had a very good student who he taught me into taking on at the commission. And so I said, Bob, help me out. He worked and he presented, he had man hours, he had this, he had that, and graphs and the whole business. And I went back in 3 days and I handed this work of Norris. And the guy says, you know, it's all very nice. Why didn't you ask for more money? I said, Bob, I should have said Bob, yeah, Bob was a student there at UT.
What was his last name?
Norris,
North.
Barb Norris.
Oh, wow.
That's part of my question. Yeah.
Oh, wait 1 second, I wanted, unfortunately, Bob Norris then worked for the Institute as he left the commission and he went on a mission to Bogota. And I was really close to him and I didn't know he had asthma. And he died.
Thank you for being here. You talked a little bit about being a token American.
Mhm.
How did you navigate your your identity as a US national when you engaged with member states, especially when US foreign policy was being questioned
Yeah,
in some
listen,
cases?
I think, and I probably shouldn't. Might be stereotyping. But the problem I didn't have any problem with governments. I handled the people that I spoke with on the level of ambassadors and number 2 people. I never had any trouble. People I had trouble with were the people in the audience. The Secretary General and the General Secretary and the Assistant Secretaries. They were slime balls. And they hated me because I wasn't one of them. They lie and they're horrible people. When the Secretary General. Somebody else. I mean, it's the kind of guy he was. When I had this friend who was a human rights guy from the state of Washington, high school, and he was going to. The Secretary General very kindly lent out the president her chats. One day was Bryce Woods. So I went with him. And as we were walking in this expensive house, our Phil is coming down the steps. And I said, Mr. Secretary General, Bryce Woods, you chat this. He said, oh, no, very nice to meet you. Very nice to meet you. He said, I'm sorry, I can't make it. I've got this important engagement. The next day in the Washington Post, he was a judge at some beauty in a bar, and some. I mean,
Time for one more question?
Well,
Awesome.
yeah,
You wanna go?
You
Okay.
ask it.
I wanted to ask, for the students here, they have opportunities to engage in human rights learning and activism through Professor Gulitsky's clinic and Professor Engel's class, but many of them are sort of learning about US law and learning how to be good US lawyers. How would you recommend they build skills, or what skills or experiences would you recommend they build if they're passionate or interested about working in the inter-American system or in international human rights law more generally?
listen. Everybody has their own path. Mine was, I figured out, I was in the service and I went to officer basic school in El Paso. And I'm from Pennsylvania. Didn't know anybody who was black. All at once I see all these. We used to, it cost a penny to walk across the bridge to go to Mexico. I thought, my Lord, I've got to learn Spanish. And that was my entree into this whole thing. The only thing I had going for me was that I could speak Spanish. And at that time, this is 70s, early 70s. There weren't many lawyers in the United States who could speak Spanish. It was a huge event. It's not available to everybody. I joined the Peace Corps. I had the advantage. My college tuition at a small liberal arts college in Pennsylvania, $100 a semester, $125. I paid out-of-state tuition in Michigan, $500. I could do things that you people can't do. Seriously. You guys have a cloud over your head that I never had. I want to say, I'm supposed to say one thing. My friend Scott here was the first intern at the commission, at the court, excuse me. So you can see, not only, you can see that I got where I was, however, figured out. But even Scott, they will get into it. The whole system.
And I was there the next summer, when that case was being argued, that you talked about, which those students know which case that was.
You already took an exam on it, you don't have.
But,
to.
yeah, I don't know, well, I don't know the answer to that, and that, there are a lot more opportunities now, but there's a lot more people interested in it. When I was there, nobody knew, and as I said before, the members of the commission I knew, and the members of the court I knew, except for Bergenthal, had no basic knowledge of human rights. Zero. And I was lucky because that was my number, 0.
How did you get selected to become the registrar of the court? And what were your responsibilities when you took that over? That was like the chief administrative officer of the court. Right?
Yeah, the registrar of the court is elected by the court. He's not appointed by the secretary general. I would have never gotten the job if it had been appointment of secretary general. As a matter of fact, when I had been acting secretary, executive secretary of the commission under very, very difficult situation. And they decided that they would make a post of assistant executive. So the chairman, who was a very powerful man, went to Orfield and said, I want you to do this. He said, okay. He said, I want you to put Moyer. Oh, won't do it. And the chairman, being the chairman, said, you're going to do it. And that's how I got that job. And so when the court decided they needed, the election came up, they chose somebody, and that person put some conditions down. Well, you ought to know better. You don't tell guys who have just become judges that I'll do this, but. So he was discarded. And he eventually wrote couple days later, I withdraw the conditions, but they said, we, come on. And then they chose somebody else. A person who ended up on the International Court of Justice in The Hague. He never showed. They went out to the airport to pick him up and no substance. So I had some experience, and it was an experience that nobody else had in effect. The reason I became acting secretary is because it was a purge in my office for sexual harassment or something like that. And instead of having 4 lawyers there, there was one, it was me, because I was too naive to get involved in the thing. So I was in effect an ideal candidate without being an ideal candidate, because you said being an American doesn't make any sense. In fact, I asked the other day how many interns, how many lawyers the court has had that have been from the United States. One for a year or 2, that's all. So it's not easy, but luck plays an awful lot, a big role.
You all probably have class, and there is a class in this room soon, so please.